Hello, everyone. Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. We'll wait maybe for just one more person. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Glenda Greenwald. I'm going to either moderate or introduce this panel. This panel is very exciting. Oh, look at that.
Busy hands.
She wanted to emphasize how exciting this was. I know that you're all totally interested in the brain, and maybe that's the attraction. We have a little star power here, Goldie Hawn, and we're not like one of the other panels giving away fruits and vegetables. But I want to take maybe 2 minutes and just talk about why the brain is the big idea. So in human history, we've already gone through the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. We've just been through an information revolution. And a new book is telling us that we're quickly approaching a new era that we might call the neuro-revolution. And it's all about the brain and neurotechnology and the new tools we have for imaging the brain, understanding how the brain works, and how all that is going to affect how humans live, work, and play. In fact, brain technology is affecting everything from marketing, advertising, culture, religious belief, artistic expression, warfare, parenting, and, of course, education. So the brain is the big idea, but how big? The decade of the 1990s was called the decade of the brain. We soon changed that to the 21st century is the century of the brain and the mind. So we've now figured out that it's going to take at least that long to figure out how the brain works. Up to now, it's said that we only understand 5% of the workings of the human brain. However, in the last 5 years, we've learned more about the brain than in the last 50 years. So things may be happening very quickly as they are in the field of technology. For example, Paul Allen and the Allen Brain Institute are about to unveil and are working on the Human Brain Atlas. They've done an atlas of the mouse brain, but they're doing the human brain. It will be announced soon. And they're putting all that information on open source, so that's going to spread widely and rapidly. And who knows if it will take 100 years for us to understand the brain. Eric Kandel, the Nobel laureate, said that the biology of the mind and the brain will be to the 21st century what the biology of the gene was to the 20th century. So we have that to look forward to. That's another reason why this is a big idea. Wanted to tell more things, but we've got such a good panel here that I want to leave lots of time for them. I just want to say that one more thought about the big idea of the brain is that almost 2 billion people worldwide have neurological disease. And if we add depression to that, many, many millions of people are involved in this, and there's $1 trillion of cost in neurological disease and depression. And that's another reason why the brain is such a big idea. So the brain takes into account so many areas of the way we live, play, and work, and our panel is going to talk about some of those ideas. So let me introduce our first panelist, Charles Conner, president of the American Lung Association in Washington, D.C., working to save lives by improving lung health and preventing disease. I think Charles is going to talk about nicotine or smoke and the brain. And I think we've got some interesting things to hear. Please, Charles.
Thank you, Glenda. Good afternoon. You're probably wondering why the head of the American Lung Association is here talking about the brain. I did myself. Let me speak a little bit about our lungs. The lung has tremendous surface area. If you stretched it all out, it would fill a football end zone. It's that big. And your lungs are really the windows into your body, and the windows take into your body such things as particles and chemicals from the air, and they go right to the brain. And of these many substances that is taken into your body, undoubtedly the worst is cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke contains about 4,800 chemicals. Many of these are carcinogens, and others are just plain ordinary poisons. We're often appalled when we pick up a piece of food or a packaging and look at the ingredients in foods with preservatives and artificial flavors. Can you imagine if cigarette packs had to reveal the same information? And just for fun, let's pretend. If you picked up a packet of cigarettes that fully told you what's in there, here's what you'd find. Under poisons, you'd find carbon monoxide. You'd find hydrogen cyanide, which is a component of rat poison. You'd find arsenic, ammonia, and formaldehyde, which is used in embalming. That's probably big tobacco's version of a preservative. Under carcinogens, you'd find vinyl chloride, polonium-210, and that's radioactive, by the way, and benzene, which is an industrial solvent, a component of jet fuel, and is known to cause leukemia. And that's just for starters. These and other components in cigarettes smoke travel from your lungs to the brain in 7 to 10 seconds. Once there, they constrict your blood vessels, reduce oxygen levels, increase the odds of a blood clot, damage the vascular system, and all of it doubles your chance of stroke. It also causes heart attacks, emphysema, 80 to 90% of lung cancers, and a host of other cancers. I was waiting to get into the Capitol building a couple months ago and ran into Sam Donaldson, who I'd worked with on a few unpleasant things in the past, and he asked me what I was doing, and I said I was head of the Lung Association, and we're going after cigarettes. He said, "That's great. Cigarette is the only product, if used properly, is guaranteed to kill the user." And so I think that's true. Each year in America, believe it or not, there are 443,000 tobacco-related deaths. 50,000 non-smokers die from exposure to secondhand smoke every year. 3,600 kids, if you were there for the last session an hour ago, 3,600 kids every year try smoking for the first time every day. 3,600 kids a day, and 1,100 of those kids will become lifelong smokers because they're having tried cigarettes. 6 million kids under 18 alive today will ultimately die from their smoking habit. So all this raises the question, why in the world would anyone want to suck on these things? And the answer, not surprisingly, is the brain. One of the chemicals in cigarettes is nicotine. Nicotine is highly addictive, as we've all heard. It acts on the reward center of the brain, just like other addictive drugs like cocaine and amphetamines. Specifically, nicotine increases the brain's level of dopamine, and that's a neurotransmitter that creates a feeling of pleasure and well-being. But for smokers, this feeling passes very quickly. As the nicotine level in the blood drops, smokers feel edgy and agitated, and that's the start of nicotine withdrawal. So in order to relieve the discomfort, smokers light up again and again, and the vicious cycle of nicotine addiction keeps going. Now, to big tobacco, cigarettes just really weren't addictive enough. They have manipulated cigarettes so that they contain even more nicotine. In fact, a recent Harvard study showed that the nicotine levels in cigarettes increased by almost 12% between 1997 and 2005. Even more damning, and I have to confess I'm a lawyer, even more damning, the U.S. Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia just about a month ago recently upheld a lower court finding that were found the tobacco industry guilty of civil racketeering under the RICO statutes. They ruled that major tobacco companies had, and I quote, let me quote, researched, developed, and utilized various designs and methods of nicotine control to ensure that all cigarettes delivered doses of nicotine adequate to create and sustain addiction. That's from the U.S. Court of Appeals. A very conservative panel of judges, it turns out. Could it be any clearer that what we're up against is the legal manufacture and mass marketing of an addictive drug? Now, how do we break this cycle? We have, again, to turn to the brain because we need to change the way we think about smoking. First, we need to recognize smoking for what it is, a vast, ongoing public health crisis, and for some reason we find it hard to think of tobacco in that way. Well, let's try to put it into perspective. In the first 4 months, we've all heard about swine flu, right? In the first 4 months since swine flu appeared, 200 Americans have died from swine flu. In that same period, 147,000 Americans have succumbed to tobacco-related illness. Is it any wonder that smoking has been called by many, including the Surgeon General, the #1 cause of preventable death in the U.S.? One of our guests today at the Aspen Institute, Dr. Julie Gerberding, said when she was head of the CDC, if she could pick one thing that would overnight improve the health of Americans, it would be to get people off cigarettes. Smoking costs the United States of America nearly $200 billion a year in avoidable productivity and health care expense. This alone calls for a big idea, and here it is. Get America off tobacco, truly a no-brainer. 90% of smokers start before the age of 21. So if someone doesn't start smoking when they're young, odds are they won't start at all. Tobacco companies know this, and for decades have seen teenagers as a fertile field of replacement smokers for the customers they've already killed. And that's been documented by the Master Settlement Agreement with all the tobacco documents that had to be turned over to the state's Attorney General, so we have that in writing. Tobacco marketers know that their products are both deadly and expensive, and so to attract new kids, they prey, naturally enough, on their brains. They target teens' impressionable sense of self-esteem with marketing that implies smoking makes you sophisticated, cool, more grown-up, attractive to the opposite sex, or a rebel. That's why they spend millions to market to kids. They create candy-flavored products, feature cigarettes in movies, and pitch them with cool mascots. I don't think anybody in here thinks that Joe Camel is meant to appeal to adults. But soon, all this is going to stop. I'm proud to say that after decades of advocacy and education by the American Lung Association and other public health partners such as American Cancer Society, the Heart Association, and Tobacco-Free Kids, among others, the President has recently signed into law the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, a law that gives the FDA the power to regulate tobacco products. So for the first time, the FDA has the power to stop cigarette marketing to kids. They will also be able to require that those harmful additives I talked about earlier be removed and dictate that nicotine levels can be reduced as well. Now, the tobacco companies are going to fight the FDA at every turn and attempt to weaken the agency's control over their products. They're already starting to do that. The Lung Association stands ready to fight back and help the agency in any way we can. We've been working for years to keep kids off tobacco. Our program called NOT, short for Not on Tobacco, is America's most widely used program aimed at helping teens and in their addiction to nicotine. We also support increases in taxes on tobacco. That's a proven way to decrease youth smoking. For every 10% increase in the pack of cigarettes, youth smoking goes down 7%. Next, we need to change our thinking about current smokers. We have to recognize that smoking isn't just a bad, dirty habit, it's a real addiction. And we have to change our belief that smokers don't want to quit or don't have the willpower to quit. In fact, 80% of smokers say they want to quit, but they've learned that nicotine addiction, like any other addiction, is hard to break and takes many, many attempts. Although most smokers try stopping cold, less than 5% succeed. The greatest success comes from a cessation program, such as our Freedom from Smoking, often done in connection with a nicotine replacement therapy and other medications. So smoking cessation programs need to move towards the top of the public health agenda. We need to push for more public funding for cessation programs and for more companies to offer their employees cessation support as part of their company health plan. Programs like smoking cessation must be included in health care coverage. There can be no bigger idea for America today. Finally, we need to eliminate exposure to secondhand smoke, which causes almost 50,000 deaths, as I said, in America each year. That's why the American Lung Association fights to protect the millions of Americans who are still exposed to secondhand smoke in public places and workplaces. In 2006, we launched our Smoke-Free Air Challenge, calling on all states and local communities to pass comprehensive smoke-free laws as soon as possible to protect people from secondhand smoke. I'm happy to announce that we've reached the halfway point in this task. Wisconsin became the 25th smoke-free state, but we have 25 more to go and still millions of Americans who are endangered by secondhand smoke. In the end, when it comes to reducing smoking, we really need to let our brains take a backseat to our hearts. It can be hard to commit to creating change when you're talking about unknown thousands of people, but it's easy to think of that one loved one who you lost or the person close to you who's struggling to quit. For me, it's memories of my mother. I remember as a child being sent to the drugstore with a note from my mother asking the druggist to please sell me the cigarettes that she was going to use. And in 1964, I was in 8th grade. I did my science project on the Surgeon General's report, trying to get my mother to quit, and she didn't. Nevertheless, it's very exciting to live in a time when so much has been accomplished in the fight against tobacco, like the FDA bill. And with health care reform in motion, there's the potential that working together we can finally break tobacco's grip on America's health. That's the American Lung Association's big idea that we'd like to present today, and thank you for your time.
good. That was great. Thank you, Charles. Now I want to introduce Dr. David Scharff, the co-director and co-founder with his wife of the International Psychotherapy Institute, which trains psychotherapists. And Dr. Scharff is very interested in high-quality training for mental health and psychiatry. And I hope he's also going to present some new information about the brain and psychotherapy, how this is now working together.
Great.
Please.
Thanks, Glenda. The first book I wrote was on sex. It was an academic book, so you don't have to rush out and buy it. But I then got quoted in Time magazine for something like saying that what was really important about sex was the relationship in which it occurred. And my mother read that and said, "Did you really have to go to medical school to say that?" So I told my mother I was on a panel with Goldie Hawn, and she said that was worth going to medical school.
That's funny.
So that's my big idea. So I went to medical school. I went to Harvard. I was in the Public Health Service training residence in Washington, D.C. at St. Elizabeth's, which is essentially the state hospital for the District of Columbia, where I was very interested in community mental health and schools and inner city problems. I worked with community organizers. I had hair that was so long that my mother wouldn't speak to me. But I've always been involved in training, in psychotherapy and in psychoanalysis, which, contrary to all rumors, is not dead, and has something to offer to our idea about what's happening with our understanding of the brain and how do we most effectively change it. So as Glenda said, the discoveries about the brain and neuroscience, which I'm very interested in, have been absolutely amazing in about the last 20 years. Starting for me with the discovery of mirror neurons in 1988 in a lab in Parma, Italy, by a researcher named Rizzolatti. And mirror neurons are neurons that we all have in our brains in the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is where your movements originate. It's been mapped out. But it turns out that right alongside the motor neurons that enable us to pick up a glass are these mirror neurons. And the mirror neurons fire when we pick up a glass in the area that corresponds to those neurons that trigger picking up the glass. But they also fire if you see somebody else pick up a glass. So they fire in your brain when you see me pick up a glass. Now, the ones that have to do with picking up a glass don't fire if I'm going to throw a glass. They fire specifically to an action. And Rizzolatti, Galeazzi, and others have elaborated on this finding at a single cell level to understand the ramifications of these single cells throughout the brain, so that they quickly came to understand that these mirror neurons are cross-modal. So let's say it's not picking up a glass, it's crumpling a paper. So you'd have mirror neurons that would fire when you see somebody crumple a paper. But they also fire if you hear somebody crumple paper. So they're cross-modal. It can be seeing, it can be smelling, it can be hearing. And then it turns out, to our enormous interest, that there's a whole system of these mirror neurons that actually instantiate, that is, they implant in the observer emotions, so that we are built to take in the emotions of the people we are related to. And that these are implanted in our brains in a way that makes it completely clear that emotion is built to be contagious, which fits with your talk this morning, and your interest in the contagiousness of joy. And it's true, Now, serious psychotherapy has always been built on the idea that it really is the relationship that is fundamental to what makes people do better. That there are techniques about doing psychotherapy that are important and that we spend a lot of time training our residents and other serious psychotherapists to do. And actually the training takes a long time, and it really should include people's own therapy, because you can't really be a therapeutic instrument if you can't understand yourself. And one of the other things that's of interest in the neuroscience findings is that we have a lot more neurons devoted to understanding other people than we do for ourselves. We're kind of impoverished when it comes to self-understanding. It's much harder work. But that working on that really matters. Now, what I'm really trying to arrive at in this is that it turns out that the single most effective machine for working with a diseased mind, which is built on a diseased brain, and that can come from trauma. Last panel I was on war trauma, but it comes from childhood trauma, from severe neglect, from hyperactive worrying, from anxiety, from depression, all of these kinds of things. The single most effective instrument is another person. More effective than drugs, although drugs have a role. They're vastly overused, and they've been oversold by drug companies who have actually hidden negative results and magnified weak results in research into amazing findings that are truly not true. But I'm not against drugs. What I'm for is using them in a much more specific way when they are useful, and also recognizing the drawbacks. But the side effects to psychotherapy are minimal. It really doesn't hurt to talk to somebody else. And since we now know that the crucible in which the child's mind grows is the mind of the parent, that the continuous cycle of taking in the infant's mind and the growing child's mind, understanding those things the child cannot understand about herself, letting them resonate actually in a way that's essentially totally unconscious in the mind of the mother, and then the mother feeds them back in more understandable ways. So in a simple way, the child is hungry or tired or fussy or wet or something. The mother doesn't know what. It's her job to figure out what, but it's largely an intuitive process. And this goes on thousands of times in the first year. Now, it's right brain to right brain, continuous interaction at a speed that is 10 times faster than left brain communication. It's not, we could say it's unconscious to unconscious, but it's actually brain to brain. Because it's so fast, we are built to decode emotionally what happens in other people very, very quickly. It's a life survival skill. We need to know these things. Well, it turns out that words are helpful in this, but words don't come online until starting after more or less 18 months. The early words, anyway, are mainly about emotions. No, yes, dada, mama, and often dada doesn't even mean the father. It's just some kind of emotional word. No usually means no. And that they're really about emotions. The emotional growth of the right brain is far in the lead over the first 18 months. The left brain doesn't even start to accelerate until after about 18 months. And then words sort of start to catch up. But words are always a poor cousin, in a way. So we might think we're having a conscious verbal conversation right now, but piggyback on that is all the nonverbal, unconscious communication, the rhythm of speech, what happens between people's eyes. It's physical gestures, the posture of the body. All these things you're decoding much faster than you're taking in what I'm saying. And we need to do that. We need to do it to survive and to live. And so the growth of the child's brain is the product of human interaction. So then it makes sense that the therapy of people whose minds have been handicapped in so many ways, from severe trauma that can lead to multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, to the more neurotic disorders that are higher level that we've all got, we're all together in that. All of these are really amenable to brain change by talking. But it needs to be an intimate relationship, and it needs to go on over a long time. There is such a thing as serious short-term therapy, but it's for certain kinds of... Basically, it works well when people have gotten into trouble, but their basic adjustment is pretty good. So when I worked as the psychiatrist for medical students and their families, believe it or not, medical students, these were Army, Navy, Air Force medical students, believe it or not, they're quite well put together. You might not think that since they grow up to become doctors, but they really are. In fact, most students and graduate students are well put together. 2/3 of them only needed a brief intervention, but the other third needed something that went on longer. It might include medication as well, but very often they didn't need that. So the problem now that we've got is the serious training for psychotherapy, from basic counseling right up through psychoanalysis, which is mainly of use because it forms the informational flow. It's really the university side of practicing psychotherapy, is that the training's all but disappeared. So now psychiatric residents don't know how to talk to people. A lot of doctors don't know how to talk to people. And the assault has come from the economic factors, from the insurance companies that do better if people don't stay in psychotherapy very long. It's better if they are on medication or in very brief therapy. There's been a kind of cultural attack on long-term work. But our population is sicker than ever. We have more abuse. We have more trauma. We have more neglect, more parents who are working, both parents working. All these kinds of things that actually mean we have a more handicapped population. And we're going to have to, if we really want to help these people, we're going to have to offer training. The institute that my wife and I founded, the International Psychotherapy Institute, which is now 15 years old, but we've been working on programs for 10 years before we founded it, teaches serious psychotherapy to people from around the United States and overseas. We have a lot of trainees from Panama and then occasional people from other places as far away as Hong Kong. And we're filling a void because this kind of training has disappeared from psychiatry residency programs, from social work programs, and social workers form most of the psychotherapists in the country, from counseling programs, from psychology training that emphasizes research rather than clinical work all too often. And so we have really felt, especially for people coming from rural places where there's no training at all available, this is something we have to do. It's a mission to restore something that had a good reputation in the 40s and 50s and 60s, was supported by NIMH. That's no longer true. And it's something that I think is missing from the health delivery system and the training system. It's part of an attack, actually, on all primary care. Pediatricians, family practice, internists are all having trouble getting the level of training they need, and so is mental health. So that we're trying to do that in our institution, and there are a few others like that, that I hope will get increased support in the coming healthcare era.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I want to introduce Goldie Hawn, who doesn't seem to need any introduction, but a great actress, producer, director, award-winning filmmaker, and now a very passionate child advocate. She has started the Hawn Foundation. You'll hear about that and the kind of social, emotional education that she wants to provide. But she has started this foundation with integrity, with passion, with joy, and with great insight. Goldie.
Thank you. I just wanted to key off of what you said about psychotherapy, which is really interesting. When I was 21, 22, I became famous overnight. And I was really pulled from the chorus line, which was very, very, it's all I ever wanted to do was dance. And, I know it sounds crazy, but it wasn't in my life plan. And next thing I know, people were asking for my autograph. It was very, very confusing. And I thought I was always going to go home, open a dancing school and teach and get married and be happy. But it's not the way it worked out. So I got very symptomatic and anxiety-ridden. I had nonspecific anxiety attacks. I couldn't go out of the house. I lost my smile. This, for me, was not possible. I really lost my joy for almost a year. And the first thing I could think of is that I needed help. And I went to a psychologist. And I was devoted to that psychologist, and we worked together for almost 10 years. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't going through the jumping over the river. It was really getting inside of the river, fighting it, getting in the eddies, sometimes in the defense modes, really, trying to figure out who I was and how I was going to handle this life of people and how they were perceiving me to be one thing, and they really didn't know me at all. So it was gaining my joy back, my self-confidence, and then at, 26, I started contemplative practice. So I started actually spending quiet time every day, meditating. It was beautiful. I learned a lot about what happens there to your spirit. Basically, it was a conundrum to me because I didn't know what contemplative practice really had to do with making me feel better and actually more connected. But it was sometimes quite wonderful and blissful and great. We didn't know a lot about brain and what was going on at that time then. So anyway, giving you a little bit of background, yes, I do make people laugh for a living, and it's what I've done. But the other part of my introduction is that I'm most interested in psychology. I'm very interested in human behavior. I'm a child advocate, given to children all my life. Oddly enough, I've given to children all over the world, but I started looking at the state of our children in America today, and I had an aha moment after 9/11 and realized that our lives would really never be the same again. And that there were some choices that were made at that time. Maybe they were motivated by fear, that wonderful limbic system we have and that makes us fight or fly or whatever. And I think some very bad choices were made. So I really look at that and say, I want to build great leaders. How do we build great leaders? How do we build children who can really be problem solve and yet have a sense of joy and happiness about their lives? And how do we improve the schoolroom? How do we create happier schools? How do we get kids to want to go to school? And then I started looking at the data, and we have 50% of our children in urban schools are not graduating at all, high school. There's a rise in suicide, which is not possible. There's a rise in depression, which is really an awful thing for this wonderful country. And in terms of violence, if I saw another child killing another child, I wasn't going to be able to handle it. So I really came to that moment where I thought, what can we do? The research that we have on neuroscience, understanding how the brain works, understanding how contemplative practice actually affects the brain in a positive way, what it does to regulate stress, how people are responding. They're using it now in all kinds of areas in terms of, doctors and insurance policies. And if you meditate or if you do this, you get this off your thing and blah, 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 blah. And I looked at it and I said, why aren't we giving this to our children? Why do we wait until we're ruined? Well, you're 40 and 50 and 60 years old and wondering, what did I do wrong? Hypertension, anxiety, aggression, unhappiness. So with my wish for all people to be happy, I really wanted to focus on the children. And so what I did was I created a foundation, founded it, and pulled together a lot of experts in the field of social and emotional learning, of neuroscience, and our people like Kim, of course, our researcher in this particular project, but in many other social and emotional programs, and pulled together something that we needed to have tested. And I really wanted children to be tested in these areas first before I went out and did anything to find out if it was really effective. They've done a lot of research on grown-ups, but what about kids? What about who's going to hold the future of our planet right now, these little mites, right? How are they being developed? Are they going to be good leaders? Are we building socially, emotionally well-balanced society? Are our schools really looking at that? Are they taking it into their responsibility, as it should be all of ours, is to nurture them from the ground up, not just to be great mathematicians. That will follow. You have to create innovation and excitement and creativity in schools. You can't squelch it by tests and teaching to the test. Because what do these things do to these children? So we're fighting a lot of other issues, too, in this time of history. And we're talking a lot of technology, a lot of inability to focus. A lot of these children are, getting instant gratification. If you go now and look, I make movies, right? So I go to movies and I see, 20 years ago you'd see a coming attraction. And you'd see a scene, and then you'd see another scene. And you go, oh, God, this is interesting. It'll get you. Now, it's 2-second edits. Mm-hmm. I mean, you go to the movie theater, and suddenly you're looking at it. I mean, is this my brain on drugs? I mean, no wonder people can't focus anymore. They're not asked to focus. They're not reading books anymore. They're not knowing what it feels like to be calm and relaxed and centered. So we pulled together people. We created this curriculum, and we did have it tested. Our curriculum, what it does, it consists of this, and we're all over Vancouver school system right now, but we started with 4 schools. But basically what we do is, and this is my big idea, is that we incorporated letting kids understand the fundamentals of how their brain works. If you do physical education, which sadly they're taking it out of schools these days, but we know how our body works, but we don't know how our brains work. And now that we know, and there's research there, why are we keeping the kids in the dark? Why don't we let them know how their brains work? Give them the idea that they actually can change their brain if they think about it, that by what they think actually can make a difference, because the brain is plastic, because give them a sense of hope, to know that they have endless potential, because they are pure potential. So that's my big idea. So we put brain connected to emotion, connected to themselves in place of empathy, compassion in the world. So we have brain, we have 3 times a day, quieting the mind, where they follow their breath and they just get quiet, and they love this. And then they go into all of your senses. And each activity is connected to an academic application. So it isn't just out there woo-woo, no. It's literally applied in this way. So they can pick math, they can pick social studies, they can pick science. All these things will center around this subject of mindful tasting, mindful seeing. Your acts of kindness, acts of gratitude, gratitude journals, and also savoring happiness. So I will say this to you. This has been the most successful program and the most gratifying thing I have ever done in my life. Because when I go into these classrooms and I see the difference in these children, and Kim will explain to you the research, but the optimism, the hopefulness of these children, and we're talking about not just regular quote-unquote children in terms of what we call normal, but I'm talking about now a challenged classroom that had some serious, serious afflictions. These children were hospitalized, anxiety-ridden. Most of them were on medication. One child saw genocide. Another one was molested by her parent. Another child was, couldn't stop moving. One child could not sleep for the 3 years. His mother said he'd not had a good night's sleep. Another child had said that he wanted to commit suicide. I went in after 6 months of doing this program with these children, and the teacher had done this. Half these children were off their medication. The child who couldn't sleep suddenly was able to sleep. The mother came in, could not believe it. And what he does is his mindful breathing if he wakes up and he goes back to sleep again. They've excelled in school, but they've been able to manage themselves emotionally, regulate their emotions, and manage their stress. Another little girl, and this is the last story because I really want Kim to have some time here to talk about this. But one story is the little girl who was in the classroom. And this was our challenge classroom. And and they're learning about the brain and all the function of the brain and everything. And do we all know what the amygdala is? Okay. So anyway, she's now stepping down off a curb and the aunt pulls her back because the car comes by. She's so, Auntie, do you know what saved our lives? And she said, no. She said, your amygdala. Now this is a 9-year-old who actually is talking brain speak. So they're beginning to realize that the activity or the action or the thing that the amygdala does 2 things. One thing, it can absolutely create havoc in our mind, make us angry and act out things that we never would. But in regulation, they realize that if they quiet their amygdala, that they'll be able to open up their prefrontal cortex and be really good readers. Also, they know that it saves our lives. So anyway, I'll close with that. I'm very excited to be able to be here today. Thank you for this. And I hope this is in every school in America, or one like it. I really do.
So, excuse me, I'd like to let you introduce Kimberly because you have a relationship and she has a special place in your foundation.
Absolutely. Well, Kim Schonert-Reichl, Dr. Kim Schonert-Reichl, we've been together for almost 7 years now, and I moved to Vancouver. And actually, she conducted the first study with the University of British Columbia on our very first pilot program. We've now done 2. They were both pretty stellar, but we have a wonderful relationship, and she's also very active in the social emotional learning world and researches a lot of these programs.
Thank you, Goldie. So I'm just, I actually have 200 slides to begin showing you, but I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to just give you just a couple of highlights, and then hopefully during question and answer you could ask some more things about the research. But I want to tell you, I have to give Goldie a lot of credit, because when she was developing this program called Mind Up, she was connected with me right away. I'm a professor at University of British Columbia right there in Vancouver. She was living there at the time. I've done lots of research in schools, specifically focused on children's social emotional well-being. And she said, I'm going to start this program, but right from the start, I want research. I know it's a good idea. I know that I really think it's going to work, but I want the data. And it was great to connect with me, because I have to say, although I'm a very optimistic person, I'm also very skeptical. And I think we really have to have the hard science and ask the questions, do these programs work? And I work on a number of different programs. What was so unique about this program, and I'll tell you two things. One is the Mind Up program actually takes the latest research in the area of developmental neuroscience, social and emotional learning, and positive psychology. Now, those are all fields that are really just burgeoning now with this idea of the brain. Positive psychology in the last decade, Marty Seligman, Mike Csikszentmihalyi have been talking about this idea. We focus so much on psychological ill-being. We need to start talking about psychological well-being. And so really bringing in all those different dimensions to inform the curriculum. Really, the curriculum is theoretically based and research-based. The second thing is now in schools, and I have to say, it's just getting there, is there's not been a lot of focus on evidence-based practices. How many times do they use reading programs that might not have a lot of research supporting them? It's more about marketing or politics or something. So there's more now of a focus on evidence-based. So we set upon really doing experimental studies, and so we've done 2 experimental studies of the Mind Up program, one in 2005 and one just in 2008. Both were experiments, which I say, where the kids were randomly assigned. There was a control group of children who received the program and children who did not receive the program. Now, that is really important to have outcome data, to have accountability. The other aspect that we did in these different research is we looked at acceptability. How much do the teachers and the children like the program? How much do they see it? Because you could have the best curriculum that's research-based, that has all sorts of things, but guess what? The teachers say, I can't use this. This makes no sense. Or the kids say, this is really boring. So it was really important that we collected both data. So what did we find? And again, I'm giving you just the little tastes of things. We did find, in contrast to children in the control group who did not receive the program, there was increased cognitive control as assessed. I worked with a neuroscientist as well as a biologist. Decreased stress as assessed via salivary cortisol. Does anyone know what salivary cortisol is? Do you know how you get it? It's a stress hormone, and you get it in saliva. Do you know what the children had to do? They had to give us their spit. They actually, in a lot of part of the whole research, what they really liked is they actually liked the spit. They really enjoyed spitting. Well, we gave them little dental rolls to do it. We played like a music for them to keep it in their mouth. Anyways, we looked at stress hormone over time to look at we found decreased stress in the children who received the Mind Up program. But they not only became more attentive, they also became happier, more optimistic, and also more empathic and compassionate. So all these dimensions. And I want to say the other aspect that we found, we looked at grades, and we found the kids who received the program had higher math grades and were absent fewer days from school. So we found a lot of different changes, both in terms of these more outcomes. But I just want to tell you, too, what did the teachers think of this program? What did the teachers think? And the teachers, one of the things that happened with this program that's very interesting is it was in 12 classrooms in 2005. By this year, it's in over 1,000 classrooms. So, and you know how that has happened? Word of mouth. This program, I have never in my life witnessed anything like this, where teachers told other teachers because they saw results right away in the program. They saw changes in children. And you know what? They saw changes in themselves. that the program had an effect on them, starting to think of being more mindful and being more optimistic, and how do we savor our happy experiences. There are now teachers, one person, administrator at the Vancouver School Board, said there is a wait list for teachers to get trained in the summer months. Have you ever heard of that happening? I mean, really, these teachers see something so critical. There's now 16 whole schools where the entire staff of an elementary school wanted the entire staff to become a mind-up school, to have this focus all throughout. The teacher said it was engaging. Kids loved the lessons. It was easy to follow. The instructions were teacher-friendly, easy access to material. They're noticing differences in the kids. And what did the children say? One of the things we found is that we asked the kids, because we do consumer satisfaction surveys. You know, it's very interesting. A lot of programs are done to kids, and you never ask kids what they think of them. And we really had to do that. And so one of the things that we found that the children, over 50% of them went and taught other people in their family and friends these skills. I don't know what kids learn in school that they go and teach so many people. The children said that when you take deep breaths, you can calm yourself and help clear your mind. When I'm angry, I just use what I learned. I can calm down. I learned that acts of kindness could make more friends for you. So the children are learning lots of different activities, both on kindness as well as ways to calm their stress. And I'll end there, and there'll be questions, I imagine, at some point.
Thank you so much. Our last panelist is Dean Kaman. I just wanted to say why he's my new hero. I just took my grandchildren to Paris, and we took a nighttime Segway tour of Paris. Dean is the inventor of the Segway. It was one of the highlights of my life. But Dean has also has 440 U.S. and international patents on tremendous devices. And to me, he's a kind of a combination Leonardo da Vinci and Mother Teresa. And you live up to that. And he didn't know he was going to talk about the brain today, but what we should all do is study his brain. And so, please, Dean.
So I'd like to start with a disclaimer. I would love to talk about some of the positive things I've spent most of my life doing, because I hope it would get applause, as it did for all of you who are doing extraordinary things. And maybe by way of introduction, I'll take a couple of minutes to say I really do work hard, and I have my whole life at doing things that I'd like to think have some of the positive impacts of some of the people here. The only one that I'm working on that happens to be related to the brain is we just finished building a prosthetic arm that's essentially fully functional. Sadly, there are 1,600 kids that have lost at least one full upper arm in our latest political endeavors, and we're trying to put them back. We need to interface with their brain by one means or another. But in preparation for today and this whole conference, which was big ideas about healthcare reform, I wanted to put a couple of big ideas out, and I'll, again, instead of talking about the things maybe I've been so proud of my life, all of my life, I will instead run the risk of insulting all of you by pointing out that we are on the cusp, finally, I think, of really dealing one way or another with our healthcare situation. It's on top of mind to everybody we talk to, not just today, but for the last few weeks and months. Everybody in Washington, everybody in business, everybody on Wall Street. And frankly, I think I'm an inventor. Inventors look at the same problems everybody else looks at and sees them differently. And defining a problem differently is normally the major piece of getting to a new solution. And again, at the risk of insulting everybody here and in this country, I think we have entirely misdiagnosed the problem because it's convenient to do so. We're looking for other people to blame. We're looking for government agencies to blame, companies to blame, pharmaceutical industries to blame, insurance companies to blame. We don't look at ourselves and say, we've created this in a free society. We get what we celebrate. And my big idea is that the people that ultimately get their way. The politicians don't really lead. They do what they think most of you want. That's the way a democracy is supposed to work. If the intellectuals at the Aspen Institute, if the wealthy people in this country can't come to grips with certain realities to refocus the agenda, I think it will be easy to keep kicking this can down the road, keep putting the pea under a different shell, because there are hard decisions that you just don't want to make. And there are some things that we've done historically that were once practical that just aren't practical anymore. So by way of that, I'd like to make a couple of observations that hopefully will allow you to at least consider the big idea is that we're not thinking about the big idea, and we should stop. I'll first start because I'm sure everybody will think, as I make some of these observations, I'm just some uncaring guy. So I'll start out by making the platitude ones that are obvious and true. We should get rid of fraud and abuse and waste, and we should train people better. And as Dr. Ahmadaz says, we should weed out the bad guys. We should have tort reform. We should not have so much defensive medicine. We should use IT more efficiently. We've heard everybody say that. We should stop spending 97% of our health dollars on fixing problems, and we spend 3% on preventing them. If the airline industry did that, they'd stop putting mechanics out there. Those people are so expensive. Every once in a while, a plane would crash. We'll just try to put it back together. Clearly, nobody in this room, nobody in the government, it sees, nobody is against getting rid of the abuse, the waste. Nobody would be against spending some more of the money more efficiently, except we are against it because we don't incentivize it. We don't build policies to do that. But I really want to say that the big idea is that we're trying to solve mythical problems. And I decided the kind of gentle in me will say, instead of it being mythical, I'll say we're making questionable assertions in our debate over health care. And those questionable assertions are that, for instance, we have a national health care crisis. Really? National health. The nation isn't obese. The nation isn't addicted to alcohol. The nation isn't addicted to nicotine. You are, and I am. We are. But among the myths, so that we can put this out for other people to deal with while we run our lives, I picked 3. I can make a few more for you, but I'll pick 3 big myths because I only have a few minutes. 1, we simply can't afford to pay for our insurance or our health care anymore. Those insurance companies, they're villains. The second myth, the drug companies, the price of drugs is out of control. And we spent this year, which is true, $260 billion in this country on pharmaceuticals. Those guys are villains. Third big myth, both sides of the aisle, all the politicians I know, all the economists I know, all the business leaders I know will sit there and calmly agree with the third myth. Our economy is heading for a disaster. You know that 16% of the U.S. economy is now involved in health care? And in Japan, it's only 4%, and they're a rich country. And in most other countries, it's way less than that. That's what they tell us. So what do we got to do? We have a crisis. We got to bring that 16% down. Those are 3 myths. I'd like to spend maybe 3 minutes on each of those 3 myths as to why I think they're the wrong statement of a problem. And if you don't state your problem properly, you probably won't get to the right conclusion. I'll give you a few facts before I address what I think are mythical assertions. Here are some facts. Obesity in the United States, I'll start. Obesity in Japan in 2008 was 3.2% of the population. 3.2%. In the United States in 2008, it was 30.6%. Well, we just said they spent 4%, and it's 3.2% obese. We're only spending 16%. We have 30%. And that 30%, if you listen to Dr. Kessler, who talked about this morning, it's rising really fast. On that basis, marginally, we're doing way better than them. I'd suspect soon we'd be at 30% just to deal with that. Why do I say that? Why is obesity related to healthcare? In 2001, from 2001 till 2006, the cost to America of dealing with obesity increased by 82% in 5 years. It went from $167 billion to $303 billion. Think about that number. A couple more facts. We did spend $260 billion on pharmaceuticals in this country this year. I don't know how many people can internalize the number, 260 billion. Is that a lot or is that a little? Well, compared to what? Well, let me put it in perspective for you. In this same year, in the United States, we spent $88.8 billion on cigarettes. We spent $203 billion on entertainment. We spent $90 billion on alcohol. $5.5 billion of that $90 billion was spent by students. To put that in perspective, that $5.5 billion in perspective, that exceeds the entire spending by students for this year on milk, vegetables, fruit, and books. We spent this year in the United States $121 billion on soft drinks. And in the United States this year, we spent $410.6 billion on professional sports. Now, if you want to put all that in perspective, I would merely ask you to go back and ask yourself, do we have a crisis with respect to, for instance, pharmaceuticals, if the entire spending of this country, public and private, for all the drugs you take to prevent your diseases, to treat your diseases, to cure your diseases, to immunize your kids, collectively, we spend $260 billion on that. You spent nearly twice that much on sports. We don't say that we have a sports crisis, a soft drink crisis, an alcohol crisis. I didn't put in what we spend at Vegas. I didn't put in what we spend on lotteries. I certainly didn't put in what we spend on home, fuel, energy, things we need. I put in, I thought, interesting comparatives. But we have such a crisis at $260 billion, we recently reached a compromise. I saw the bills going up and back in Washington, where we've managed to win. At least that's the way it's been portrayed in the big fight between who's going to get the villains in this society of ours. And we've gotten some new deal by which the government is going to get back from the pharmaceutical industry $80 billion over the next 10 years. Again, that's a fifth of what we'll spend this year on sports. But it was considered a victory, a win-win. I'd suspect if you state the problem wrong, maybe it's a lose-lose. Because we also have a stimulus package. We're desperately trying to put money out to make our economy better. If we took $80 billion out of the companies that make the pharmaceuticals, they could only have been using that money for two things I can think of. Do research with it, make more of their product with it, or, worst of all world, it's profit. If it was profit, you get 40% of it back as taxes anyway, then they dividend, you get another half of that. But instead, my guess is what those pharmaceutical giants will now do, like any other business, is have $80 billion less to spend. What industry do you want to have less to spend over the next 10 years? Which of these industries would you rather we now give that $80 billion to? We have Rita Caldwell here. We have people that have run major government agencies here. I could ask Dr. Kessler, who ran the FDA, how much money are we now spending at NIH on research on drugs? Last year, it was in the single-digit billions of dollars. The pharmaceutical industry last year spent $45 billion on research. It probably makes good jobs. It probably cures diseases. It's probably a major piece of what this country exports. If we were going to put a stimulus package together, where else would you want to pour money than in high-paying jobs, in industries to improve the quality of life, et cetera, et cetera? The healthcare companies were also told they're the villains because we can't afford health care. I'll start an insurance company right here today, and I'll bet I could get banks to support me. If they read the small print, I'll get a lawyer to help write it for me. If you think health care is expensive today, Tell me the year you liked the price of health care when it wasn't a crisis. This country loves crises. We now solve everything by crisis. And in a crisis, typically, you do things not very efficiently. That's why it's a crisis. If I started a healthcare company today and said, I'll charge you whatever you used to be paying when you didn't think it was a crisis, I'll give you care at least as good as you got in that year. That would be easy to do in the healthcare industry. In 1920, I don't know what you paid. And by the way, you can pay me in $2009 what you would have paid in any year you like. If I told you I could sell you a house today for what your parents paid to build their house, mine at the end of World War II was $7,000, $8,000. They sold it after they lived in it for 40 years for a few $100,000. When I first got a driver's license, a car cost $2,000, a Mustang. Today it costs $40,000. But we don't think those things are a crisis. Their costs have gone up astronomically, and their performance is marginal. A brand new house today built out of sheetrock and plastic isn't quite as good as the ones out of brick and plaster. A 2,000 square foot house now costs 10 times what it cost 50 years ago. You get less quality at a much higher price. The reason we don't have a crisis is nobody wants more of that stuff. The healthcare industry, the healthcare insurance companies could easily give you the quality of insurance you got at a much lower cost. They don't have to treat you lifelong iron lung if you picked a year like 1920 because they give you a $2 vaccination against polio. You pick the year you like the health care, we'll give you better health care than you could have gotten because of the marvels of technology at much lower cost. The problem that we don't want to tell each other is it's not that the cost of health care has gone up, it's that the value of it's gone up so fast that everybody wants all they can get. What's available today is so extraordinarily high, we're no longer in a position where the rich people can buy what's available and we can sort of give to the rest of them because we feel good. There's so much out there, nobody can afford it all, not even the rich, and we certainly can't afford to give all the rest of it away. So we forced insurance companies to make tough decisions because we don't want to make them. And then we say it's too expensive. Go analyze it. The only industry in the world where you could live with yesterday's pricing and get value you'd be happy with is healthcare. Again, the third myth, the third myth, 16% of our economy and going north is a terrible place to be. If we collectively both demand of our government and our insurance companies and our doctors lower and lower costs, but more and more miracles, and we assume that it's bad that we're all going to collectively and individually pay more for it, we have a problem, people. So why don't we just accept something slightly different? The richest country in the world that now feeds itself with 2% of its population and can feed most of the rest of the world out of what we don't eat. The richest country in the world is now spending 16%. That should be something we're proud of. We should continue to grow that and export that the way we exported all other things that we invented, from cars to electronics. We ought to spend it wisely because it's such a big piece of the economy. We ought to get really good value. We ought to look at outcomes. We ought to fix all the problems with it by being responsible individually and not blaming other agencies. But we should go forward assuming that this country over the next 100 years is going to be in the age that you spoke about, of the brain and of the mind. The greatest opportunities for human advancement are in the field of healthcare. It should become a bigger piece of our economy. We should lead the world in what we spend on it, what we get for it. We should have the best domestic healthcare. We should export that around the world, and we should embrace it. And if we continue to keep pushing it around, Washington is going to give you what you deserve. If you don't want to be responsible for yourself and your family, we're giving up a huge opportunity, and we're about, in this crisis, to make crisis-level decisions that we're going to regret. Your children are going to regret. Your grandchildren are going to regret. The big idea is don't do that.
Thank you. Well, do we have time for question, Q&A? I eventually want to ask the panel if they would like to ask each other some questions, but are there questions in the audience?
Just a simple one. Kim, can you please describe what actually happens in the classroom?
Okay. Well, and Goldie could jump in as well, I think.
Yeah, I can tell you what happens in the classroom. What happens is they start week one, basically understanding what the brain is like. So they get their first lesson on the brain. Then they're taught how to quiet their mind. So they do their following their breath and so forth. And then they do listening exercise where they hear a sound, and they have to follow that sound all the way until it's finished. So they raise their little hands when they don't hear the sound anymore. So it all helps with focusing and bringing them down and getting them relaxed. Then we do the first lesson, and the first section is not acts of kindness, is you and your senses. And they start becoming aware of their senses of mindful tasting, for instance. So that week or 2 weeks coming, our subject is mindful tasting. So what they do is they have like a little thing on their desk, and the teacher brings it in, and it could be a Hershey's Kiss. And they learn what it is to look at it, they examine it, they spend time on it, they remember it, then they put it in their mouths. They cannot swallow it, they have to roll it around, they have to feel the texture, feel what it feels like, what it really tastes like. So it's mindful tasting in its perfect sense. And then the gratification comes as they wait. It's also teaching them to learn for gratification.
Is it cocaine?
It's not cocaine. No, it's definitely not cocaine. And then they swallow it. Then they write about it. And they begin to express how they feel about it. And with all of it, yes, some of these aspects are graded, but they're loving being a part of their own learning. So it takes that 2 weeks to focus on everything on tasting mindfully, right? So then you bring in obesity issues. You bring in issues with diet. You bring in, what's good for you, what isn't, what people eat around the world. So it keeps them mindful of these things as they're learning in school. And then it goes on to mindful seeing. And you can bring in all kinds of other things. So it keeps all of these ideas alive. When you get down to acts of kindness, then they do things for the community. So they gather around together and they do acts of kindness to each other or to the community. And they begin to figure out what would be a good thing to do in order to help someone else. So in all of these things, it is not an add-on per se, but it's how you incorporate these things throughout the school day, hopefully the school year. And what we've found now is that a lot of these places want to become mindful schools, so it becomes the culture of the school itself. It does not inhibit learning. It only promotes a much more socially, emotionally responsible child, much more self-aware. So these little things that sound very lightweight actually help them focus their attention. It helps their brain learn how to sit on something longer. There is a level of gratification, and as they learn about their own brain, which they do every day, they realize that this emotion actually lights this part of the brain. So they know that these feelings also come and go. So they're beginning to be able to manage correctly their anger, their fear, and so on and so forth. So it's sort of how that goes.
Right, and I was just going to add, it's a curriculum for kindergarten through 7th grade. And there's different curriculums for the different grade levels. There's for early and then later. There's 15 lessons in total that are across all the that can be then integrated throughout all the curricular areas. So the 15 lessons can be drawn out all throughout the whole school year. And it really is about integrating it within the curriculum. So for instance, one of the things they could do with literacy, they do a gratitude journal or they do gratitude exercises, which we know now from research in positive psychology that when we take the time to start thinking about what we have to be thankful for in our life, we actually increase our happiness and decrease depression.
This is a great place for me to jump in terms of the gratitude journal, which was really interesting, is that when they write their gratitude journal, actually makes them feel better, right? So when kids are having problems in their school in this one particular classroom, these kids, what they do is they go to their gratitude journal to go back and reread it in order to bring them back to a state of optimism. And it's interesting because no one tells them to do that. It's just what they instinctively want to feel happy. We all instinctively, really, all we want is happiness, right? So when they're that close to the source and they're so little, they somehow innately know that in order to help that sort of deficit, that sadness, that maybe if they went back to their thing, and they do it on their own. So it really is, it's great, but I'm sorry to interrupt you.
I just wanted to add at a neuroscience level, the optimal situation for the growth of the brain is a positively toned interaction with somebody else over time. And this is an educational application of that.
Exactly. And you know, the state of America today, where one parent is working, there isn't another parent in the household, they don't have the nurturing oftentimes. So, you know, this is the time when, you know, you have to look at your surroundings. I mean, I understand parents saying, I'm the parent, I don't need the school to be the parent. Well, I think we have to look at it much more holistically. And we need to have this embedded in our system.
Well, also, the parents are supposed to hand over certain functions to the school. And the
Right.
child needs to grow in a wider world.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Goldie, I have a quick story and a question for you. In 1981, I horrified my friends and family by joining the Army to become a doctor.
Oh.
They told me I was committing career suicide. I was crazy. I told them that I aspired to become private.
That's funny.
I love it. Several years later, I followed Joseph Campbell's advice on following my bliss. I became a psychiatrist. It was only right.
Yeah.
So now, 20 years later, Brigadier General, DOD's brain doc. I think you and I really got the best laugh.
I think so too.
Okay, on a very serious note.
Great.
Have you thought, you know, at the Defense Center of Excellence, Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, I mean, our charge is to reach out and to connect with these young troops.
Yeah.
America's troops. Have you thought about bringing this to DOD's children?
Well, that's great, and we'll talk about that. The answer is yes. Also, in terms of that, the work is also being done actually with some of our soldiers that are going over and coming back that are helping with post-traumatic stress, and it is working. It's wonderful. So, absolutely, thank you for that. And because these kids really do need it, no question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Grace?
A huge number of children on drugs because of ADD or ADHD. Now, are any of the children in the classrooms
Yes, ADD.
labeled that?
Yes, definitely.
It seems like a great program to sort of modify that behavior a little bit.
It does modify it. It has shown to modify it. And there's more research to be done. I think Kim actually is going to do some research on this particular school that's implementing. In this classroom itself, there are 8 kids with ADD, and he's noted a noted difference himself, self-regulated noted difference in his ability to focus, keep his hands still, and keep himself still in class, which is one of the things. But I'll tell you a lovely story. One kid has autism, and you know, when they get nervous, they shake and do repeated things. And he went up, one of his classmates, which shows you the empathy and interconnection in the classroom, went to the teacher and said, Johnny's got a problem. He's shaking, and he's having, you know, because we're taking a test. So he said, the child said, do you think we could do our mindful breathing together, and it might help him? So here is this child helping his schoolmate who is, you know, unable to stop doing his repetitive shaking because of his nerves and because of his escalation of his problem. And they sat down, they did the breathing. The child stopped shaking and took his test. So it, you know, it sounds so simple, and yet has such a profound effect on the brain.
How long has this been going on? And
We've
when
been-
will they publish something about it so it can be incorporated in this country?
Well, it is being incorporated. We're in Alexandria, Virginia right now. We're going to be in all the elementary schools there.
And I would actually say to learn more about it, go to the Hawn Foundation website, hawnfoundation.org. Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's a V in there. There's another Hawn on the planet. What did I know?
Go ahead.
Yes. This is a little bit esoteric, but hope the panel can address this. The dentate gyrus in the hippocampus of the limbic system is one of the major areas where you have active neurogenesis, where you're constantly producing new brain cells that impact learning, memory, particularly long-term memory. Very important bit of knowledge, actually. What I'd like to know from the panel is what kinds of factors, both positive and negative, impact centers like this, and maybe discuss some of the ramifications for schools, psychotherapy.
Well, you know more neuroscience than I do, but in general, trauma constricts growth, and it doesn't just constrict the growth. It's not so much the number of neurons; it's their connectivity, because maturation actually is a matter of pruning neurons and increasing connectivity. And it increases the complexity of the brain. And that's different from the regeneration question or the growth for new memory. Trauma severely constricts that process and results in lower brain weight. Whereas positive interactions over time increase complexity and connectivity all across the brain, certainly in the orbitofrontal cortex, which is where the most complex processes go on, where the most capacity to inhibit the automatic amygdala responses that are just fear-based, that for in PTSD or in these traumatized kids, they keep thinking everything coming in is fearful and that they have to react with fear. It's not just the bus coming down the street, it's everything. And you need a well-developed limbic system and orbitofrontal cortex in order to inhibit that automatic lower brain function. But so that part in general is clear.
Go ahead.
Yes. About 3 years ago, there was a psychiatric emergency in my family, and that caused me to go to the McLean Psychiatric Hospital in Boston to try to learn more about it. After a brief conversation with the doctors, I was ready to leave. They said, "Not so fast, young man. You're depressed, clinically depressed." I didn't realize that. That led to actually spending a month at that psychiatric hospital. And the reason I mention that is they were able to learn so much about me, and because of the genetic fertile constellation of connections, they were able to understand or develop hypotheses about my children, which led to their going there. And the reason I mention that is in that process, of course, talking to my friends, peers, so forth, there seems to be such a reluctance to talk or admit or to go to psychiatrists. My immediate extended family, I think, could benefit from going to psychiatrists, but they simply will not go to psychiatrists, and their physician doesn't have that kind of background. And so the question in that is how can we make it more acceptable to have mental health, I don't want to use the word weaknesses, but
Issues, we'll call.
Well, you're a very good advertisement for the success of a good intervention, it sounds like. I think there are organizations really working to increase the acceptability of these kinds of ways of thinking and of access to mental health care of all sorts and at all levels. And it is an important public health issue. There's no question about it. I think one problem has been the kind of selling of one kind of solution, pharmacologic solutions, as opposed to the more complex and sophisticated ways of thinking about these things that really is required in every situation. But I very much like the idea that when there is one index person who has trouble, that whoever is thinking about it, think about the whole family and the extended network and how their suffering may be part of the problem. I'm a family therapist as well, and I think this is terribly important.
in my family,
Yeah.
according to
No, you're so what?
the lay opinion.
I appreciate your story and your generosity.
I think that's a good idea. And also, if you, to get more comfortable with psychiatric help, you can meet a lot of people from New York. And once you meet the people from New York, you know that it's just par for the course to have help. So.
You know, I read that the number of psychiatrists
Well, it isn't anymore. It was until the early 80s.
ADD, which is so widely diagnosed today, is not adaptive. The brain adapting to the evolving world. Because when I grew up, there were about 5 TV stations, and we would go to the toy store. It was a small toy store, very few choices to make. Whereas today, there are 800 TV stations, and everything is a big box store, and there's such a
Well,
Good point.
it's a very complicated point. ADD, I think, is a stress breakdown product of this kind of overload. It's clear we're seeing more of it. It's not just that we recognize it better, it's also there's more of it. And I think it corresponds to these 2-second movie trailers and everything else. But the things underlying it are more complex than that. So actually there have been very interesting studies in monkeys, in rhesus macaque monkeys at NIH, showing that the monkeys who would be ADD kids who do very badly in the monkey troops, they tend to be more males, they're thrown out, they don't survive as well, all of this. But if they're given a super mom, they become troop leaders. The genetics underneath it represent gene options, and it really depends on how we meet them. So if these kids meet a program like this or get good treatment, and the families get help with this, these kids have enormous potential. It's not just a breakdown product. It's a symptom of vulnerability, but like with many vulnerabilities, treated well, and I don't mean just by psychiatric treatment, although that's a good way to do it too. Treated well, these become stronger kids.
I am treating mine, but I'm wondering...
No, that's fine.
If the treatment will ultimately be a mistake.
No, I don't think so. No, I think when kids can't make it in their ordinary social environment, they need help. Now, I think that we overuse the medications, which are targeted very well for some kids, but then, like it's too much of a good thing. There are kids for whom it's not the answer. So then it's no help.
In the back, Linda?
It's a deterrent.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I've been looking at, and Goldie, we've talked about this, is how in our relationship to technology, we don't breathe. And I'm going to be talking about this more tomorrow.
We don't what? Say it again.
We don't breathe.
Breathe.
Our posture doesn't allow us to breathe. Our relationship to a laptop or a cell phone. And so we sit in this swamp of fight or flight chemicals when we're working with technology. And I'm not saying technology is bad. I was at Apple and Microsoft for 20 years. Technology is great. Our relationship to technology could change. And one of the very simple things we can do is train ourselves in different breathing habits. And that's a practice. Athletes and musicians study that. I think what Goldie is doing is absolutely profound. And I want to know, you met with Arnie Duncan, you talked about it this morning. What you have is a program that is positively profound because we know that mindfulness, breathing, these are things that upregulate parasympathetic nervous system function, and they do really have a profound effect on attention, emotion, and cognition. What can we do to start bringing programs like this, even pilot programs, into the schools? In this country, love that you're doing it for Canada, Goldie. That's great. What can we do?
Well, I'm not doing it just for Canada. In fact, we're in Alexandria, Virginia now in the elementary schools, New York, New Jersey. So we are in America. What I really wanted to do, Linda, was make sure that this program was true. That we really had a model up in Vancouver. It was a great model. That's where we did our research. We wanted to make sure this research was really a quantifiable, really important research. So before we really went out and gave it to kids and did it that way just to spread it out, I wanted to make sure that it was good. Also creating a replicable model I thought was important, so we did. We've got a great model in Vancouver now. It's easily replicable, so this is what we're going to be doing in the Washington district, the area. So that's kind of what we're doing there. But I did talk to Arnie about it. But, Arnie's got a lot of things on his plate, and, as I said to Arnie, your schools are important and we need to organize this, but our kids are broken. It's not the schools. So we need to take a look at that. Really, that's a serious problem because, you can put a child in a great school, but if you don't have not trained your teachers properly and you're not training to the 21st century and the stressors around us, the new world we're living in, you're not going to make it. I don't care how much money you throw at it. These programs are cheap. They're not expensive programs, and I said, with a good program like this and a beautiful banyan tree and an extension cord, I could probably teach a great 7th grade under a tree as long as I have information from the computer and some books. So it really is about changing your thinking about this. And he was right there. He listened. I think that there's some funding that needs to go to these organizations, SCL, Castle, people like that, us who are out there with these programs, because these are things that are going to change our kids and change ultimately how school works. So that's, and slowly, right?
Thank you. Joni?
Well, I just want to say how excited I am about your program, Goldie, and the exponential effectiveness it's having with the kids, expanding it in their own peer group and their homes and families. We did a piece for Glenda and Betsy Highfield for the Children's Health Foundation on the anti-bullying program a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was the most rewarding thing I ever filmed. These little elementary kids, but they target their emotional intelligence. There's a connection between what you're doing and some of these other programs that maybe piggyback on each other that have a long track record now.
Right.
And you see these little kids and what leaders, and they're in their truth, they're in their integrity. And when you hear the stories of how difficult some of their family life and they were successful, it just empowers them.
Well, the other part of it is, it's, with going to the Kumbaya place is really nice, right? But it also helps them learn. Because the idea is, how are you going to open the mind for learning? How are they going to actually become innovators and creators of the next generation? So that's also what's exciting. You know what I mean? So it's a whole spectrum.
Melissa?
This is also a leadership question and really a stigma. I live in Washington. I have a number of friends that have recently been appointed to positions in the government and are awaiting confirmation. There are 3 big questions that they get asked by the FBI, number 1, and by White House counsel. One is alcohol and drug abuse. One is financial history, taxes, and the other is mental health treatment. And I'm really wondering what we can do about this, because my generation
That's a very good point.
has grown up knowing that if we go into therapy and we want a job in the government, we're going to have to talk about it. So I'm wondering what the
Wow,
That's amazing.
There needs to be a march on Washington on that one.
Yeah.
I don't know if I think.
You're ready to
Smell
go?
the coffee.
I thought that wasn't allowed on.
I didn't
you're
either.
probably too young to remember that Thomas Eagleton was
yes.
unable to become vice president because now it is true he had shock therapy because he went to the wrong place. But
Well-
I think if he'd had psychotherapy, it might not have been automatic anyway.
But we just got the 0. We're done. But one more great question? Who's got the great question? Yes, and then we'll go.
I just wanted to share that I have a private school for ADHD where we do mindfulness training to the children, as John Cabot said.
Oh.
And the children have gone out to be major leaders,
Oh, bravo.
major developers, major inventors, and these are children who are really
So
not
great.
making it.
Makes me smile.
But I have a sad part to this. I wanted to help children's poverty. So last year, I brought this to No Child Left Behind. We had 8 schools that were failing schools that are now A&B schools. I get very choked up over this. Children who couldn't read, who read. Children who didn't want to do homework, children who went out to reading groups. And we were the most successful Dade County. Our application for next year was not accepted by the state of Florida.
Oh, my God.
Because people are trained, the corporations, that they pay someone to write the application on how they wanted to, the people sitting in their chairs wanted to be heard. They're the ones who get it, who don't care about kids, give them pizza and have them sign their name. And I think it's heart-wrenching. And I have parents, I have principals calling out to senators. And
Well, I think you two need to talk. I think this has been a fantastic panel. Thank you very much.